What are the ramifications for the American people of China's sentencing of Jimmy Lai to 20 years in prison? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that gives you all the principled presentation of libertarian principles, genuine libertarian principles. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel, longtime principled libertarian. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to be with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks y'all for tuning in, and thank you always for your great support. So, Richard, we have an interesting development overseas in Asia, specifically Red China, Communist China. They have just sentenced a man named Jimmy Lai to 20 years in jail, which is essentially a death penalty of conviction sentence because Jimmy Lai has diabetes and other very serious health problems. He's 76 years old. A 20-year sentence in some Chinese prison is clearly sentencing him to death. And what is his offense that they convicted him of? Violating some new national security law that China has enacted, which obviously has very interesting ramifications for the United States and the American people. And so let me give a little context and background here, and then turn it over to you, and you can correct me if my history in here is faulty. But let's keep in mind, first of all, that China is a national security state, just like the United States is. Okay, they both are governments that wield omnipotent powers, the power to kill people, to take people into custody, hold them indefinitely, give them a death penalty offense like there in the Caribbean that the U.S. national security state has done to people without trial or due process of law. China has all these powers. But we're dealing, interestingly enough, with Hong Kong. That's where Jimmy Lai was a resident of. Now, historically, and this is where you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Hong Kong was once a colony of the British Empire for many, many decades. I'm not really sure how long, but it was governed by the British government. And so you had this phenomenon that while it's there next to communist China, people had civil liberties, they had democracy, they really they had a large degree of economic liberty, as I understand it. Totally different kind of system than Red China. But it was always understood that this agreement whereby the British Empire had control over Hong Kong would expire at some point. I don't recall the exact date. But in leading up to that date, China and the British government enter into an agreement where China agrees that Hong Kong will continue to have all the civil liberties that they're accustomed to. Nothing's going to change. Everything's fine. And of course, most people in the West knew that this was just a sham. And it turned out to be a sham. That power is power. And once the takeover took place, it took a while for the Chinese regime to slowly make its way into the governing system of Hong Kong and the economic system. But ultimately, the die was cast. They took full, complete control over the society. They suppressed any criticism, any dissent. They put down protests. Well, this guy, Jimmy Lai, was a big tycoon, if not a billionaire, certainly close to it. He had established some kind of clothing business. He's very successful, multimillionaire. He could have left at any time and lived a very nice life in England or the United States with multi-millions of dollars. And instead, he is very principled. He stayed there and said, no, I'm going to fight to maintain this democratic system, this civil liberties system here in Hong Kong. And he took on the communist regime directly. He established a newspaper, I think it was called Apple Daily, or a website, and started criticizing what they were doing. And he knew what was going to happen. And he got jailed several years ago. I forget what he got. It's like a 5-year jail sentence. They put him in isolation And to make sure it was pure isolation, they even put a block over the one window to the outside. And as you know, isolation is a form of torture. It drives people crazy, literally crazy, insane. And then he got released at the end of that 5 years, but then continued his activities. I mean, you got to really admire the guy that he's now being proposed for the Nobel Prize, but he violates this new national security law, which makes it sedition, insurrection, or whatever. You know, those words sound familiar over here, don't they? That because he's criticized this communist regime and their communist system. And so they give him this 20-year sentence. Of course, no trial by jury or anything like that. I mean, they could just execute him, but or assassinate him, but they've given him this sentence, and so now he's looking at a 20-year sentence. And so it has a lot of lessons for the United States, Richard. Certainly freedom of speech lessons, the freedom to criticize government without being shot in the back, without being shot in the face, without having to spend 20 years in jail, without being executed. But it's also the deeper lesson, the one that I have been focused on for many years now at FFF, and that's should the United States be a national security state? And we weren't always a national security state. For the first 150 years, we were a limited government republic, and we've adopted this communist totalitarian system. And it's a very dangerous system. Our founding fathers warned us against this. Ike Eisenhower warned us against this in his farewell address. John Kennedy took him on. We know what happened to him. So I think when we see something like that, we shouldn't just think, oh, those Chinese they're just bad people. Look what they're doing. Because when you point the finger like that, there's three fingers pointing back at you. And I think that's the opportunity for Americans to do some soul searching, especially as we see people here that are taking on the government, getting shot in the back or shot in the face, and whatever. What do you think, Richard?
Well, if I may, I'd like to just sort of add some additional details about your brief account of Hong Kong. Hong Kong became a British colony in 1842, following what was called the Opium War. Um, the British were trying to sell opium in China. Uh, the Chinese government had drug laws making it illegal. They destroyed some British opium on some ships in the port of Canton in southern China. A British fleet showed up, blew up the fort protecting Canton, uh, moved up the coast and did more of this. And finally, in the peace treaty, uh, the British were given a variety of concessions, but one of them is that the island of Hong Kong and the adjacent peninsula of Kowloon were to be British territory in perpetuity. Then in 1899, because of the need for more jurisdictional and just logistical space, uh, a new agreement was signed between Britain and China to lease what were called the new territories, which in square mileage made up about 90% of the colony of Hong Kong as we in modern era knew it. And so that lease was going to run out in around 1998. In 1897, 1898, when the lease was signed, I mean, 100 years seems like a long time, but finally 100 years passes or begins to pass. And it was the Margaret Thatcher government that entered into the negotiations with the Chinese government in the 1980s, 1970s, and made this arrangement that jurisdiction would be transferred back to China in 1997. Not just for the new territories where the lease was, but also Hong Kong Island and Kowloon Peninsula, because the Thatcher government decided, whether in retrospect a wise decision or not, that because of the dependency on the mainland of China for water, fresh water, certain sources of electricity, uh, that keeping Hong Kong Island and the Kowloon Peninsula themselves as a much smaller British colony would be logistically and infrastructure unsustainable. So in 1997, all of Hong Kong was returned to Chinese political jurisdiction with the understanding that for 50 years, that is till into the 2040s, for 50 years, it would be one nation, two systems, as they referred to. There'd be the communist government on the mainland of China, and then there would be a continuation of the internal administrative system within Hong Kong that would respect civil liberties, freedom of the press, a democratically elected municipal administration, uh, and that China would leave it alone. And as you were mentioning, that the people had wide civil liberties, degree of political freedom, though through most of the colonial period, it was administered by a governor general who was appointed from London. Fortunately, in the World War II period, the governors that were assigned by the British government um, ended up being implicitly laissez-faire kind of guys. They basically left Hong Kong alone economically. So much so that maybe some of the viewers remember that when Milton Friedman did his famous multi-part TV series Free to Choose, the first episode has him in Hong Kong as an example of what economic freedom means. There were virtually no regulations, no restrictions, no prohibitions, extremely low taxes. And, if someone could escape from mainland China, welcome. You're now a resident of Hong Kong during the British period. But uh, within a few years of Hong Kong being transferred back to Chinese jurisdiction, and people continuing to express their views uh, forcefully and publicly, both individually and in group demonstrations, on disagreements with events occurring on the mainland and threats alluded to affecting them, the Chinese government started cracking down. They began to manipulate elections. Uh, they started sending in sort of clandestine enforcers and police agents, um, and then basically manipulated the municipal elections to basically stuff them with all of their dupes and puppets, and then passed these new laws saying that Hong Kong was now under the same administrative restrictions as on the mainland. Restrictions on public demonstrations, restrictions on freedom of speech, freedom of the press. That's what got Jimmy Lai in trouble with his newspapers and other media outlets. Um, and then basically saying that anyone who undertook such actions would clearly were only do it to destabilize the society in Hong Kong, and would only be doing so because invariably they were agents of foreign powers. In other words, under the influence or the control of foreign representatives. Uh, and so this is the charge against one of the charges against Jimmy Lai, that he was in the service of foreign powers wanting to undermine China and its national integrity. So as a consequence, they put him on trial. He was held for several years in solitary confinement. The verdict was issued just a couple of 3 days ago, and according to one of the Bloomberg news reporters who got into the courtroom, it was like 2 minutes. The verdict was like over 100 pages, but they wouldn't read anything. It'll be issued. He's found guilty, and his punishment is 20 years in prison. End of story. And he was taken away. Now, supposedly, this Bloomberg reporter said that he was smiling. He waved at the people in the audience, including the media. So he's putting the strongest and most positive face on what is a fate that means he'll be in prison forever. He's about 78 years old. He has the health problems that you were referring to, Jacob. And if he were to serve his full term, I mean, he'd have to live till 98 years old to be released from prison. So, and by the way, he holds a British passport. He holds a British passport. He is technically a British citizen, which is carryover of the legacy of Hong Kongers during a certain frame of time being allowed to apply for British citizenship which would basically give them an exit strategy. Now, Lai chose to be there for the kind of reasons that you mentioned, but technically he's a British citizen. Now, Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, was in Beijing a couple of weeks ago and supposedly brought his case up. But clearly, the Chinese government doesn't give a damn because they've just given him this 20-year sentence. But the other point, if I can just add now, is that it shows the importance and the relevance of freedom of speech. That the ability to criticize a government, to say what the government doesn't want, can be really more powerful than a gun. You know, Mao Zedong mostly said, all power comes under the barrel of a gun. Well, when do you have to point a gun at somebody? When they speak truth to the emperor, when he tells the emperor that he's wearing, if not no clothes, false clothes, perverse clothes, dictatorial clothes, tyrannical clothes, imposing bad and wrong policies, and that he's the problem with the society, not the people over which the tyrant rules. And that is what governments fear, because if one person speaks out, others may listen. And if they're persuaded, they may choose to talk as well. And the little pebble always runs the risk of becoming the avalanche that brings the political system down. So this is why it has been important to them to set an example of Jimmy Lai. But it also shows the very weakness that they don't have the power of ideas on their part. They only have the power of a gun.
Yeah, but what I find so fascinating about this is that they clearly have total power over the citizenry. I mean, they're a national security state, just like we are, and they have all the guns. Now here we have a lot of people owning guns, which is like a nice little insurance policy against the tyranny, the potential tyranny of the national security state here. But what I find fascinating is that notwithstanding this total power, they still feel threatened by
Yes,
one guy saying things.
yes.
What's the danger when you have all the guns and all the power and total control? What's the big deal just saying, let the guy speak as much as he wants? What's the problem? We don't care. He can't do anything to us. It really goes to show you, Richard, that there is a power of ideas and ideas on liberty, and they're scared to death of that power because it's always possible that something can just sweep across the country and take the country by storm. And they fear this idea that 90% of the populace, even if they're disarmed against the government, which is armed, there could still be problems for that government. I mean, that's the only thing I can assume that they're scared of.
Well, you'll recall that just a week or two ago, we spent the time talking about the situation in Iran, and of course, U.S. policy towards Iran, but Iran. And notice, tens of thousands of people came out on the streets of both Tehran, the capital, and other cities in Iran. And people obviously were communicating with each other through the internet, sharing free thoughts on what was wrong and what they should, as groups and cities, go out and do and demonstrate about. And what did the government do? It shut down all forms of communication. In other words, it's like putting a gag on the around the mouths of every person in the country so they cannot talk to their fellow citizens to express their anger, their resentments, their frustrations, their disapprovals of their own government, and to communicate ways to demonstrate that in a public way of going out on the street. Governments are afraid of ideas because at the end of the day, they can kill you, but you can't kill an idea if the idea can at least remain in one person's mind.
Yeah. And I think it's important also that to recognize that Americans can easily see tyranny in overseas regimes. I mean, when they see something happening like this to Jimmy Lai, they can say that's just horrible. That's just horrible. But Americans have a blind spot when it comes to their own national security state. For example, if we look at Guantanamo Bay, okay, it's easy to say, oh, well, this guy didn't have a jury trial and it just took 2 minutes for them to reach a verdict and stuff. At Guantanamo Bay, the national security state has taken people into custody and not given them a trial at all. They're there for 20 years with no trial.
Right.
And if they're given a trial, it's before the same type of kangaroo court that China uses, the military tribunal. There's no trial by jury of one's peers like the Constitution requires in terrorism cases or any other criminal offenses. And that came about because of the 9/11 attacks or this revolutionary judicial system in Cuba. Or you see these killings in the Caribbean. If China, imagine if China were out there killing people on the high seas indiscriminately and just saying, well, they're violating our opium laws over here and we're going to just kill them. People could say, oh my gosh, they're just killing people indiscriminately over there. And yet, when it happens over here, everybody's quiet, everybody's silent. Oh no, we can't criticize the Pentagon. Oh, then Trump. Oh no, that would be heresy. We can't do that. Now, I think there's a good part of this is at least there's people protesting in Minneapolis. And I think that's a good sign because to shoot somebody in the back because he's protesting, because they don't like what he's saying, or to shoot a woman in the face and then call him a terrorist because they're protesting. I mean, it's good that it seems to me that some people are waking up and saying, hey, this is a dangerous situation. And this is what our founding fathers understood. When they set forth a limited government republic, it was with the idea that we will never have this type of government. We will never have a national security state, which they called a standing army at the time. And Eisenhower, writing his farewell address in 1960, points us out. He says, okay, we've got a different kind of system now. And it's a very dangerous system. It's a dangerous system to our democratic processes, to our rights and liberties. He called it necessary. I challenge that. I think it's been a racket from the beginning. But it's time that the American people recognize what we've been saying here for 36 years, Richard. Your greatest threat to your freedom and well being does not lie with the Chinese government. It doesn't lie with the Russian government, the Iranian government, the North Korean government, the Cuban government, the Venezuelan government. Your greatest threat to your freedom and well being lies right here at home with your own federal government and your own national security state. And that's where the focus should be, the primary focus.
Well, I think that what we see with Jimmy Lai and what we have watched with these ICE agents and incidents in Minneapolis should reinforce the importance of a freedom of press and the ability to communicate, because this would have been just put under the rug, this killing of this fellow with the shot in the back while being pinned down on the ground. And it would have just been able to be brushed off as a terrorist act, as the authorities almost instantaneously tried to claim. And who could challenge this? He had a gun. Yeah, it might have been a licensed gun, but he came to this with a gun. Why would he have done this unless he had, bad motives and intentions in mind? How can we challenge what Trump says? And even the critics of Trump would be able to say, well, it doesn't seem right, but how do we know? But you do know. And how do we know? Because within hours, within a couple of days, there were enough people who had been on the street and videotaping this on their phones from this angle, from that angle, and then to be able to put them all together and to see the truth of what was done to this innocent man. That shows the importance of freedom of communication, of the press, of speech, and the ability to just share your ideas and things that you happen to photograph on that thing with all the other people in the society. That is essential to maintain whatever liberties we still have and to try to claw back the ones who have lost.
Yeah, but the mindset of the government officials here, it seems to me, is no different from the mindset of the Chinese tyrants. They don't want people there at those protests. You just stay away from ICE raids. This is what we're doing. This is our job. Our job is to grab illegal immigrants, deport them, and this is what we got elected for. Don't interfere and don't protest and don't criticize. Or if you want to do it, go do it in the privacy of your own home. It's clear to me that these government officials do not like criticism. They don't like challenge. They don't like those cell phones being taken pictures and videos of what they're doing. And if they have their druthers, they'd rather put those things down just as surely as the Chinese regime puts down Jimmy Lai.
Well, look, that's why they try to assert when they confront people on the streets that the citizen does not have a right to photograph them or videotape them. I understand the courts have said you have that right to do it. So they're trying to spread lies to intimidate people to not present possible evidence to reveal the misconduct they do. The evildoer does not want his evil acts to be made public. He just wants people to either look the other way, or to be so sufficiently intimidated that they just passively let it pass. The people in a free society cannot allow this to pass. Otherwise, we will have no freedom.
Well, and there's the fear factor. They want to make people afraid. That's why these thugs use masks because it's scary. My gosh, somebody could just pull over and on the street and grab me. That's masked, and you don't know if they're government agents or not. They could be armed gang members kidnapping somebody. Somebody just kidnapped that mother of that newscaster. How do you know when somebody's pulling up alongside you that it's a legitimate police action? They don't have marked cars or all. But fear is the coin of the realm. If they can engender fear in the citizenry, people tend to stay away from protesting. It's not worth it to go over there and risk getting shot. I got kids, I got family, I got an education I got to get. I don't want to get shot over there by these thugs. I'm going to stay away. So they win.
Because normally we have taken for granted when our police have been on patrols on the streets, they have a badge, and a badge has a number. And you can either write it down or memorize that number. And so there is a person who can be held accountable for his acts. These people show up in masks with no identifying marks, do not have to or even think of showing ID. I mean, if detectives come to your house, you don't have to let them in. You can ask for identification. It has their face, their name, and their badge number on their detective ID. But these people just roam like thugs with the ability to do so anonymously, with no ability to identify them facially, no ability to identify them with a form of government ID, and basically do whatever they want. And as you were saying, to intimidate them. This is not the way a free society operates. I'll even go further. You know, they say, oh, what if their identity is shown and then somebody wants to threaten their family? You know, every job has a job description. If you don't want the risk of bad things happening to you or your family, get a different kind of job. It's like the idea that, well, the police aim to shoot, kill. No, you should first off aim to disarm the person or shoot him in the arm or the leg to disable him, not to kill. Well, he might shoot me and my life would be at risk. Yes, that's your job description. Live with it or get a different kind of job. That's not an excuse, in my opinion.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the house thing because, the way the country was set up, the government was set up originally is that before you could go into anybody's house, you had to get a search warrant issued by a
Correct.
judge. And now
Correct.
they're issuing their own little search warrants. They call it
Correct.
administrative search warrant. Well, that's just signing your own search warrant saying I'm going to
Correct.
go into the person's
Correct.
house. I
Correct.
mean, if that's not the essence of tyranny, I don't know what is. And I think in the closing moments here too, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention what's going on in Venezuela. The government, the U.S. government, including the executive branch and the national security branch, are cooperating, reinforcing, maintaining a brutal socialist, communist, narco terrorist regime in power, one that rounds people up, suppresses freedom of speech, just rearrested one of the people they had released because he was saying let's go out and have a protest again. They said, oh well, you're violating the conditions of your release. I mean, this is that it's not a big step from supporting a Soviet type communist regime and imposing one over here. If you believe it's proper over there and it's legitimate for sake of stability, it's not a big leap to say they'll do the same thing over here if circumstances require stability as well.
Particularly when you have someone in the White House who clearly, seemingly admires other leaders around the world who have that absolute power and appears to envy their capacity to do whatever they want without courts or Congress doing anything to interfere.
On that note, we'll wrap things up. Richard, excuse me. You're choking me up, Richard. Uh, on that note, we'll wrap things up. Thank you all very much for tuning in. And Richard, look forward to seeing you next week.
Until next time.